But in Matthew chapter 26, verse 17 through 19, it says, "Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?' He said, 'Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they..." Where am I? Okay. Now, this is going to take some getting used to. "Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples..." I read that, didn't I? Yes. Did I read that? No. Now, I'm skipping down to verse 26. "Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.'" The thing that really jumped out at me is the scriptures refer to the Passover in dealing with the bread and the blood. We speak about communion. What I want to do as we go through this particular talk this morning is I want to look at the Passover not from the 21st century, but I want to look at the Passover in terms of what the first century Christians were hearing. You understand what I'm saying? I want to know what was in their mind and what was in their heart as they were partaking of the Passover. I am strangely aware that within Western Christianity, we've missed something. We have missed that connection with our historic roots. Can somebody say historic roots? Israel, as a nation, had three main feasts. The first one was the Feast of Passover. Passover was commemorating Israel's deliverance from the land of Egypt. Somebody say deliverance from Egypt, which means deliverance from bondage. So the first feast, and that's the one that we're going to be looking at, but the first feast that they experienced was the Feast of Passover. The second feast that they experienced was the Feast of Pentecost, which was 50 days after they celebrated the Feast of Passover. Now, for them, the Feast of Pentecost was celebrating the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. You'll remember that God brought them out of Egypt, brought them to the mountain, brought them to Sinai, and upon Mount Sinai, God gave them his word. God gave them his laws. God gave them his instructions. But he had told them that you are to keep these feasts. So it's not that you're going to do it one time, but I want you to keep these feasts as a remembrance. A remembrance. The third feast that they celebrated was the Feast of Tabernacles. Tabernacles was celebrating and reminding them of their journey through the wilderness where they dwelt in booths. You know, when they came out and God said, I'm going to lead you by the pillar of fire by day and the cloud by night. And You make these dwellings. When you see the cloud move, then you all move, pack up what you have, and keep on moving. And so that became the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, three times a year, Israel had to go up to Jerusalem to celebrate those feasts: the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus did it. The early church did it. Somebody say, Jesus did it, and the early church did it. And as you read through the book of Acts, you will find Paul making references to these feasts. Said, I have to go, because I want to be sure that I can be at Jerusalem for the feast. You'll keep finding these references that Paul makes to the feast. The feast that he was referring to was either Passover, Pentecost, or Tabernacles. Now, an interesting thing happens within the church. Within the first 150 years of the church, something happened. We know that the first believers, the early believers on the day of Pentecost, they were all what? What was their ethnicity? The first Christians. They were all Jews. Paul, or Peter, goes and Peter preaches to Cornelius' house. Y'all remember he preached to Cornelius. That's where God let down the sheet and told him, whatever God has cleansed, don't let any man call unclean. And so God, by this, was revealing to Peter that the gospel was not just for the Jews, but the gospel was for the Gentiles as well. However, over the next 150 years, the Gentile believers began to outnumber the Jewish believers. And as they did, they began to divorce themselves from many of the practices of the early Christians who were all Jews. Y'all still with me? We're going to see how this ties into communion in a minute. And so the Gentile believers begin to adopt other types of practices to replace those practices and those feasts that God had ordained for his people to keep. Now, by the time we got to 325 with Constantine, y'all remember Constantine, when Christianity became the state religion of Rome. And in order for them to be accepted into the church as it was under Constantine, they really had to divorce themselves from their Jewish roots. So in the process, Christianity went from being a sect, a group of messianic believers who believed in Jesus, the Messiah. They went from that to just adopting a system that was designed primarily by Greek and Gentile ideas. Y'all still with me? Did you ever notice Jesus never celebrated Easter? Did you ever notice Jesus nor the early church celebrated his birth? So where did these come from? They came in through the institutional church so that they could make it more acceptable to the masses. They began to kind of synthesize the message of Jesus with those already religious traditions that they had, and they came up with the system that we now know as Christianity. Now, here's another interesting thing, because the same time that that happened, the power of God also began to diminish. So you see less of the activity that we read about in the book of Acts, and we see more of a turning to just simply embracing a system of belief. God was no longer moving. The next thing you know, we entered into this period of history known as the Dark Ages. Why was it the Dark Ages? Because the light of the gospel had gone out. But yet the church was very powerful and in control. Y'all still with me? Now, let's look at the Passover. Now, this is interesting. Can y'all see those two pictures pretty clearly? On the left, we have more of probably how they celebrated the Passover. As Kendrick read, they recline at the table. They're eating this meal. And during the meal, Jesus took bread. He blessed it, break it, gave it to the disciples. Then he took of the cup and said, drink all of it. So that's typically how they would have been celebrating communion. Is there a difference between how they would have celebrated communion on the left, which would be your right, and the way we typically celebrate communion? It's much more individualistic. Can y'all see that? In the one case, you have a communion, you have a meal, you have a fellowship. I was even thinking last night, I said, God, I really want to recapture the spirit of communion. And I said, I should have a foot washing service. Because y'all know Jesus washed their feet. That's right, sure did. During this communion service. Have anyone ever experienced a foot washing service? It is one of the most humbling, beautiful experiences in the world. But we've kind of lost that in some areas. So what we're going to look at, I want to know, what would a first century Jew have understood when Jesus said, I want you all to go and I want you to find this man, and when you get there, tell him that the Lord wants to have Passover at your house. What would they have been thinking? And what is with Passover anyway? Exodus chapter 12 is where we find the story of actually the institution of Passover. You remember that God has sent 9 plagues against Egypt. Pharaoh refused to let the people go. So Pharaoh said, God said, okay, I'm going to send this one last plague. It's going to be the death of all of the firstborn in Egypt. I know y'all remember that because we all saw the movie. It's going to be the firstborn of men, women, boys, girls, cattle, sheep, dogs, cats, mice. The firstborn of everything in Egypt will die. Now, Moses, this is what I want you to do. Verse 13 said, I want you to tell all of the congregation on the 10th day of this month, every man take a lamb. Somebody say a lamb. I want you to take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. Now, later in verse 6, he said, you shall keep it, the lamb, until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Now, get the picture. He says, Moses, on the 10th day, every man needs to go out and get a lamb. Keep that lamb, though, until the 14th day. Then on the 14th day, I want everybody to kill the lamb. Don't kill it on the 11th day. Don't kill it on the 12th. Don't kill it on the 13th. Wait until the 14th. Because all of the congregation needs to be involved in killing this lamb. Y'all got the picture? See, the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, they were not as individualistic as we are. Growing up in America, we are very individualistic. They were more collective. They thought in terms of their I was the whole nation. They viewed themselves as one people. And God viewed them as one people. He says, I'm going to want all of the congregation to kill the lamb at twilight. And then, this is the good part, then they shall take some of the blood. Somebody say the blood. And put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat.